To discuss the future of conservatism, please welcome two of our greatest Australian champions of conservative values, Tony Abbott and Amanda Stoker.
How good was that? We miss you, former Prime Minister.
I miss you too, Amanda.
One of the things I loved about the address you just gave us is the way that you drew our attention to the kind of historical or intellectual snobbery that C.S. Lewis pointed out to us so long ago. The idea that because culture is always changing, everything that happened in the past should be judged against the standards of now, and that we should assume almost by definition that what we're doing now is definitely better than everything that's been done before. How do we deal with that?
Well, we have to appreciate that our knowledge is not perfect. Our wisdom is not superior necessarily to that of everyone who's come before us. Was it not Newton who said, if we see far, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants? And I think it was John Howard who defined a conservative as someone who doesn't regard himself as morally superior to his grandfather.
We owe a lot to our grandfathers and our grandmothers, and it's really interesting, though. We have a culture now where people of my age and younger are being told it's their duty to call out the wrong think of their elders over Christmas dinner, lest they be allowed to bring their terrible ideas into the world after they've had their Christmas lunch. How do we get this right?
Well, I think one of the things I often say is that a majority that stays silent does not long remain a majority.
Quite right.
And I think part of the difficulty has been that good people have been too polite in the face of things that defy common sense. Now,
Too right.
you know, I am obviously completely out of step with the modern world because I don't like the climate cult. I don't like the virus hysteria. I can't understand the gender fluidity push. I don't like the magic pudding economics. And I particularly dislike the cultural self-loathing. And yet these things are now almost conventional wisdom, even in our schools. I mean, I can remember as early as 2006 or thereabouts, going to a school in my electorate to present a flag. And after I'd done the flag presentation, the principal asked me if I'd like to visit a classroom, and naturally I was delighted, and I walked into the year six classroom, and would you believe it, they were talking about climate change. And I said to these kids, I said, look, what causes climate change? And they said, pollution. I said, right, fair enough. Do any of you know about the Ice Age? And they all put their hands up. And
The ice what?
And then I said, so was the climate different then? And they could sense that something was coming, something difficult.
Hands went down.
And so I tried to explain as briefly as I could that climate has changed throughout the millennia, and it hasn't necessarily had anything to do with human beings. But at that stage, the teacher rushed me out of the classroom.
Well, look, if Tony is out of step and out of touch, I must also be out of step and out of touch. And what about you? Are you out of step and out of touch too?
But we can't let politeness stop us from expressing ourselves and contradicting in a polite and respectful way stuff which is palpable nonsense. And this is where I think we do have an obligation to talk to our neighbours, our workmates, our children, our grandchildren. And again, sometimes we've been unduly deferential. I can remember door knocking in the 2019 election in Warringah. I knocked on the door of a house that was probably worth $10 million, and a woman about my own age answered, and she said to me, I can't vote for you. And I said, why not? And she said, because my children think that your climate policies are wrong. And I said, well, what about you?
It's a secret ballot, Mama.
And she said, well, I'm prepared to take my lead from them. And I said, but hang on a minute, who is the adult in this house? And I think we have been remarkably shy of being the adults that we should be in so many of these things.
I think that's right. There's also a use of the good nature and good manners of Australians against them,
True.
I think, by many in the political class.
True.
Even just in the last week or two, we've had now Prime Minister Albanese say that to divide Australians by race in our constitution is, quote, just good manners. Now, Australians are very polite people, although sometimes they're the most fun when they're a little bit cheeky and a little bit larrikinish. But the good manners of Australians being used against them in order to change their constitution to fundamentally divide Australians into groups with different rights and different privileges is a terrifying thing.
And look, I think that there's universal goodwill to Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
And I think there is a real, I suppose, I mean, we want to do the right thing by every Australian, particularly Indigenous people, because they were the first, and we all know that at different times in our history, Indigenous people were not treated as they should be.
Absolutely.
But what we shouldn't do is forsake the important principles that have made our country special and precious in an attempt to apologise for bad behaviour in the past. You know, two wrongs don't make a right, and just because there may have been institutional discrimination in the past is no reason to institutionalise discrimination in the present and in the future. And just because it's meant to be
100%
benign doesn't actually make it acceptable.
That's exactly right. How about Australians for constitutional equality rather than anything else? Education's got a really important part to play in the way forward. And it's important we have parents and adults who are prepared to be adults. It's also important that we're teaching our kids the right stuff. And I'll give you a story from my life. About 2 weeks before the last school holidays began, my eldest came home from school in tears, distraught. And she's a deep thinker, and in some ways she's a deep feeler. And she was distraught because they'd been taught about climate change. And what she was told by her teacher didn't match what she'd been taught at home. What she'd been taught at home was really that there's nothing to be fearful of, nothing to panic. And that, like any science, you approach this with a long-sighted view of the evidence and with a preparedness to look at all of it and sometimes change our minds. Whereas what she was told was dogma. Her tears came not because it didn't match what she'd learned at home, but because she felt there was a betrayal in that her teacher was brainwashing her rather than encouraging her to engage with the evidence on the subject. How do we get our schools to understand that their job isn't indoctrination, their job is to teach people to be free thinkers?
Well, again, Amanda, it took us a long time to get into this deplorable position, and I fear it's going to take us quite a long time to get back to where we should be. The long march of the left through the institutions has nowhere been more pervasive and more destructive than in our educational system. If there's one thing that should characterise any educational institution worth the name, it's the disinterested pursuit of truth. Now, yes, we should respect what's gone before us. We should be as familiar as we can be with the canon in all areas, but there's got to be this insatiable curiosity. What more can we know? How better can we be? And yet instead of that, it's almost like we've gone back to the Middle Ages where there is dogma, only it's not Christian dogma, it's anything but Christian dogma, with modern-day inquisitions hunting out modern-day heretics and, if not burning them at the stake, at least cancelling them. Now, what we need is in our schools, we need more principal autonomy, we need more parental involvement, we need much more academic rigour, and we need, frankly, our best people going into the teaching profession. Now, again, this is a multi-generational task. It involves a big cultural shift. Above all else, we should regard it as an honourable and a wonderful thing for the best and the brightest of us to become teachers one way or another. And if there's one thing that I was very lucky to have in my education experience, it was priests and nuns teaching me, because in those days, these were the finest young people who went off to give their lives to God, and they expressed that vocation through teaching in Catholic schools. Now, it's probably too much to hope for a revival of vocations, but nevertheless, we do need to somehow get our best and brightest more involved with our educational system, because other than our parents, no one has more impact on us than our teachers.
Round of applause for the Honourable Tony Abbott. Thank you so much for everything you have done for our country. Thank you for everything you still do for our country.
Thanks, Amanda.